So you are very welcome to the first talk of the Modern History Research Center this year, and we are really honored to have here Professor Markus Wein, and he's going to be introduced properly by Professor Chris Aldous here. So there we are.
Thank you. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Markus Wein from the American University of Bulgaria at Blagoevgrad. Markus is a good friend and colleague of the history department here because he's taught here for a semester. I think it was 2014-15, and was a great colleague. You were covering for Natalia's course, weren't you? So we know Markus very well, and he's done papers here several times, I think. He's professor of European history at the American University in Bulgaria. He's an expert on modern political and economic history of Central and Southeastern Europe. He's written extensively on German-Bulgarian relations. He's produced a monograph on economic relations between Germany and Bulgaria between, I think it's 1918 and 1944, and you published that in 2007. And I'm delighted to hear about his new edited book, which he's going to talk about today, which is on the screen, Everyday Postsocialism in Eastern Europe. So thank you, Markus, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really great to be back here. It's really like coming home for me, and everything, the entire environment here is so familiar that it's really like, it feels like coming home. I've already kind of walked through the center of Winchester today in the afternoon, and it's kind of really this permanent deja vu that you get here. So I really enjoy that, I have to say. And yeah, my paper or my talk basically is indeed about a book that I co-edited with a colleague of mine, Jill Massino, who is associate professor of European history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And she basically approached me, when was it, 4 years ago, I think it was, with that idea. So I have to give the credit to her for the idea of doing this here. I can actually circulate that book here, so people can look while I'm talking. And so it's in a way a little bit of course, of a promotion tour that I'm doing here, trying to sell that book, even though there isn't actually that much to sell. The book is available for free on the website of the publisher, Purdue University Press. So you can download it from there as a PDF for free. So anyway, we're not going to make that much money with that book. But of course, it would be great if people would use that book. I mean, the main idea of the book also is for it to be used for teaching purposes. So in undergraduate, probably also graduate courses that are in some way related to the recent history of Eastern Europe. So of course, all this is about the transition from the communist regimes to what followed after. We're calling it here post-socialism, but of course this is a contested, a disputed term, because post-socialism doesn't really say very much as a term. It just says it's something that followed socialism, but at the same time, this term already illustrates in a way the confusion that has resulted from that transition and the very, let's say, unclear character of what followed socialism. So instead of really giving it a definition of its own, we cannot really say much more than this is what followed socialism, without really being able to determine what that means. In any case, however, we're looking at the level of everyday life. So we're taking kind of a bottom-up perspective. This is about the experience of the so-called normal or ordinary people, how they experience post-socialism in their everyday life, but also how that everyday life probably also connected or was still connected or carried on with the legacy of socialism. So yeah, so that's basically what I'm doing here. I'm presenting this book. The book came out in September this year, so it's really quite fresh still. It took us about 4 years actually to get that ready. Particularly, of course, with the pandemic, which in a way kind of disturbed and and inhibited, if you will, academic work in many ways, also turned out to be problematic for us. On the other hand, I've contributed to edited volumes before, which took 4 or up to 7 years in some cases to come out. So 4 years, I think, is still not that unusual. We had to find authors, and then these authors had to write their contributions. They had to understand first actually what our idea was. This was a lot of writing feedback, writing editing work, of course. Then we had to find a publishing house. We were really happy to get green light then from Purdue University Press, a relatively well-established publishing house that also contributes, of course, to, let's say, the publicity of our volume. But now I think we should probably start talking about the idea of the volume and also the content in a bit more of a detail. So one of our authors in this book, Viktor Petrov, a Bulgarian born associate professor nowadays at the University of Tennessee, he notes that actually very few people in Eastern Europe understand that year 1989, so the presumable transition from socialism to post-socialism, the year 1989, 1990 probably. So very few people in the East understand this year really as a clean break with the socialist past. Now he, of course, being of Bulgarian origin, talks mainly about Bulgarians in this context. Bulgarians, for instance, don't really look at this as really a clean break, a clean rupture, but they call the events of that year actually just the changes. So they give it a very neutral label. The ambiguity of this term changes also illustrates the lack of judgment actually that goes together with it. So it doesn't really tell us anything about whether these changes were good or not. However, thinking back to those times, it seems to me actually that we all assumed that these changes were actually for the better. And therefore, we are irritated when we hear Bulgarians talk about this really as changes, as something neutral, neither for the better nor for the worse, obviously. And our volume also is trying to basically serve as a corrective to the assumption that the changes from 1989, 1990 were by default for the better. There was the assumption that now human rights would blossom all over Europe, including Eastern Europe, after the collapse of communism. And now, they appear to be blossoming now, but we already see, when we look at other authors of our volume, for example, a professor from the Polish Academy of Sciences who contributed to our volume, Joanna Wawrzyniak, points out that human rights actually were very, very quickly plowed under in the transition to liberal democracy, or to be more precise and more accurate, liberal democratic capitalism. Particularly in Poland, with a very influential Catholic Church, the notion of human rights that would now really be spread all over the place, so to say, also in a way disappeared and was replaced by a very strong, for example, anti-LGBTQ position of the Catholic Church. Now here we have, for example, another Polish author in our volume, Agnieszka Kosianska, who very, very pronounced, in a very pronounced way, works to this. Hungary, under the leadership of the well-known illiberal Viktor Orban has erected barrier after barrier between his own vision of a Christian, ethnically Magyar Hungarian Hungary as a, in the words of another author, Hadley Rankin in our book, as a so-called heteronormative nation. And on the other side of that barrier, those that do not fit to the ideal of this heteronormative nation. Therefore, it appears actually that the events after 1989, if we look at them from a distance, are perhaps best viewed as in a way, hollowing out of alternative visions of globalism or globalization and liberal capitalism. So basically, it appears, in the eyes of many at least, that what the changes actually brought in 1989 and 1990 was, first of all, capitalism of the neoliberal kind. So the term neoliberalism also repeatedly appears in our volume. I have to make a remark here in this context. I'm not really a great fan of this label neoliberalism. So in other words, I would not always fully agree to everything our authors have written in this volume. The problem I have with that term neoliberalism is that it really, in a way, actually tries to identify kind of an opponent, an enemy, so to say. And it always sounds a little bit as if everything that has happened in Eastern Europe since 1989, 1990 was the result of some sort of a conspiracy of a neoliberal global elite. And this is, I mean, it's not explicitly, it's not explicit in the chapters, in some of the chapters in this volume, but in a way, I find it's sometimes a bit, it's implicit at least. And it also doesn't really take into account that certainly, there were quite a few countries in Eastern Europe, for example, Bulgaria and Romania, which did not have liberal governments for many years. The socialist parties actually remained in power in Bulgaria and Romania, and the economic crisis in both countries that really took extreme forms in the late 1990s was actually much, much more the result of a lack of economic reform policies and the continuity of a state-run, state-operated economy. So it's not all about neoliberalism. I'm not denying that neoliberalism plays an important role, particularly in countries like Poland or also in Hungary. Indeed, we see very straightforward neoliberal reform policies, but not everywhere. So neoliberalism does not explain everything that happened in post-socialist countries. Some of our authors have a slightly different view on this, but that's, I mean, we thought that this is okay. We, being the editors of such a volume does not mean that we are censoring our authors. Right, but certainly in the eyes of people remembering that transition, these changes, capitalism is indeed the most fundamental, or the transition from a centrally planned economy to a capitalist economy is the most fundamental change. These changes indeed also went together then with certain, indeed substantial losses that people were suffering back then. So we should always be careful as well with this notion of nostalgia for the socialist times, because this nostalgia is indeed in many cases connected really with substantial losses that people were suffering back then. A decline of living standards, the loss of jobs, skyrocketing prices, and so on and so forth. And this experience of particularly of economic hardship is, of course, something that can easily create a nostalgia for socialism. But this is nothing that people could be blamed for. So, for instance, privatization and globalization, again, has meant indeed the loss of worker autonomy. And for example, here we have one study in our book that deals with the closing of sugar plants in Czechoslovakia. We have another chapter about the demonization and expulsion of formerly fraternal socialist students and workers in Bulgaria. So students that had come, for example, from African countries that were like brotherly connected with Bulgaria in socialism. And of course, also we see indeed in other contexts the entrenchment actually of party elites across the supposed rupture of the collapse of communism. So in other words, the problem of elite continuity across the alleged system change, which actually created a continuity of power relations across the system change. And therefore, again, I'm saying neoliberalism does not really explain everything, but we do see cases indeed, particularly when we look at Poland and Hungary, where old communist elites then very quickly switched to neoliberal economic policy making. Whereas in other countries, we see actually a continuity of state-run, centrally planned economy, at least for the first decade following the change, so through the 1990s. So orienting oneself and society in this world meant to basically cope with an uncertain future, and of course also searching for, in a way, a usable past in time. So as some form of a social and historical orientation. One chapter, for example, deals with Romanians living abroad, who are forming kind of a diaspora, which actually have sought to shape Romania as a normal country in the face of the abnormality of the transition present and or the state socialist past. It was also not only, as we have it in another chapter, children in Eastern Germany that were suffering feelings of loss, disappointment, and disillusionment in the face of the changes. So in the 3 decades since 1989, the discourses have shifted. In the beginning, it seemed everything was actually about the creation of normal societies in the post-communist eastern half of the continent. Eastern Europeans apparently were to rejoin what, as Gorbachev put it, was our common European home. Francis Fukuyama, you certainly all have heard his name, became a star by announcing that we had arrived at the end of history, which was basically equal to the promise of a single destination for all human society, and that was liberal democratic capitalism. Not everyone was there yet, but arrival for all was certain, according to him. And indeed, many of us believed it. Personally, I have to admit that I believed it too back then. History itself had reached a destination, and history was quickly moving in that one direction towards its own obsolescence, towards its own end. Then, however, the 30th, so if we now jump 30 years ahead in time, the 30th anniversary of the collapse of communism has then, however, produced actually a range of studies which already present a very different and a very mixed picture of the developments of those 30 years. And little of what we have originally expected indeed had become a reality then, obviously. So there are important books, for example, the one by Kristen Gotzi and Michelle Orenstein, the book Taking Stock of Shock, as it's called, which says the irony is that the transition to liberal democracy and free markets was largely achieved through undemocratic means and failed to generate widespread prosperity. So this disillusionment, this disappointment is what they're pointing at. And Gotzis and Orenstein's book outlines a series of East European crises. So, of course, we see results such as very, very gross income inequality. We see a mortality crisis in Eastern Europe, a fertility crisis, so declining birth rates, and of course also a migration crisis, so an emigration crisis. At the same time, public opinion surveys nowadays in Eastern Europe, so I'm talking about like in the last 5 up to 10 years, reflect really a striking ambivalence among people about this transition to liberal democratic capitalism. There is, for example, the famous Pew Center study published in October 2019. It's called European Public Opinion, 3 Decades Since the Fall of Communism. And it shows that in every country in Eastern Europe, with the exception actually of Poland, approval of the shift to a multi-party electoral system and a free market economy has actually decreased significantly since 1989. 76% of the Bulgarians, for example, approved of multi-party electoral systems in 1991. In 2019, this has declined to 54%. Also, the approval for a free market economy in Bulgaria has declined from 73 to 55% in those 30 years. And roughly the half of the Bulgarians generally now approve the changes of the year 1989-1990. Only 32% actually say that the transition has actually improved their own standard of living. In former Soviet republics, this approval is even lower. Back in 2019, only 43% of the Russians approved multi-party elections. I mean, they were already deeply under Putin already at that time. And even fewer in 2019 in Russia, 38% approved of the free market economy. But even so, here we can say, all right, yeah, this is probably something we would have expected. But even in those, success countries of the transition, at least this is how they were viewed in the 1990s, like Poland, the Czech Republic, and also the former German Democratic Republic. We have now disapproval rates of free market liberal economy between 15 and 25%. At that time. And I think in the meantime, these numbers have even increased. If we take all of Eastern Europe together, only 41% of Eastern Europeans believed in 2019 that the collapse of communism has been to the benefit of ordinary people. 56% believed that ordinary people have benefited not too much or not at all. So generally, indeed, great disappointment, great disillusionment about these changes. Of course, it's true, the young and better educated are more supportive of the changes. But these are actually at the same time exactly those people that are leaving Eastern Europe, that are part of this immigration movement. There is, for example, an article by Tim Judah called Bye Bye Balkans, a region in critical demographic decline. And he projected that Bulgaria will have 38.6% fewer people by 2050 than it did in 1990. Bulgaria's population has already declined by now in real numbers from around 9 million in 1990 to fewer than 7 million today. So emigration is really a significant problem. And these numbers, now I'm picking here Bulgaria as an example, but you can apply this pretty much in the same way to other countries in the region. A country like Moldova, commonly viewed as the poorest country in Europe, has already lost over 1/3 of its population since 1991. But also the winners of the transition. So again, Poland, Hungary are in a demographic crisis. Poland is projected to have 15% fewer people in 2050. Hungary, 20% fewer. And this goes together also with a decline in political participation. So obviously we have a decline in people, in populations in post-socialist countries, a decline of people in post-socialist countries that in any way or in a very general way identify with their own society as a cause for themselves. Something that they would in a way also be willing to get involved with. So again, Bulgaria as an example, we see this decline. In 1990 still, we have 91% voter participation when it came to the election of the Constitutional Assembly, which drafted the new post-socialist constitution for Bulgaria. 91% voter participation. The number has now arrived at a level of something between 32 and 38%. Bulgaria has actually had 7 parliamentary elections in the last 3 years, and most of them with a voter turnout of something between 37 and 38%. The election in last June, even only with 32%. So indeed, those who in a way take some form of participation in political, in social life in Bulgaria are clearly in a minority position. The overwhelming majority, a 2/3 majority in Bulgaria, has given up on participating in political life in Bulgaria. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge that we see similar developments also in Western countries, in Western democracies. And therefore, we should not just simply blame all this only on the countries of Eastern Europe, on the post-socialist countries, but it's certainly more extreme there. So we have this decline in a way, identification with their own societies as a cause. A second trend that we see in this context has been also the striking rise of what we could call savior candidates or presumable strongmen, which have grown and have expanded their political influence in Eastern Europe. So in other words, people that are in a way originally from outside of the political system who then come to rescue the country from the political class and the chaos that the political class has created. Probably the most prominent case of such a savior was again to be found in Bulgaria with the former Tsar of Bulgaria, Simeon II, who had been infant Tsar of Bulgaria from 1943 until 1946, so in the terminal phase of the Second World War, and who then basically went into exile in Spain and came back to Bulgaria then in the late 1990s, and was elected Bulgarian prime minister then in 2001. So a former king of a country becoming a prime minister in the country at the time when it is a republic. So still kind of an outstanding case. He came from outside. That was probably the most important thing here. Basically, immediately he went up to 43% in the parliamentary elections of 2001, and was then prime minister of Bulgaria for 4 years. More recently, we see in Bulgaria, we have seen the rise of a popular late-night television show moderator, Slavi Trifonov, who founded his own party, which is also now in the Bulgarian parliament. And of course, also, as in many other European countries, we see the rise of the radical right. In Bulgaria, this is now the so-called Revival Party, under its leader Kostadin Kostadinov, a clearly open pro-Russian party, which has reached about 17% in the last parliamentary elections. These elections, by the way, were held in early November. This is when the last parliamentary elections were held in Bulgaria, the 7th, within 3 years. So we see at the same time that Bulgaria obviously has significant problems, forming governments, because parliamentary elections do not really produce any clear majorities. And even the current parliament, which resulted from that 7th election, is now struggling and has not really come to any sort of an agreement based on which a new government could be formed. So this is still a very open question. So the Bulgarian political system certainly has moved from crisis to crisis, which is obvious and evident also from these very frequent parliamentary elections. So we can say the time has certainly not moved uniformly in one direction, in the direction towards liberal democracy with capitalist economy. And you start wondering, of course, were there missed opportunities? Could they, in a way, have arrived at a certain historical destination at some point? Now, under the conditions also of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, anyway, it seems that all questions have to be put on the table again. We have no answers at this point, we only have questions. But let's get back to the year 1989. What was the spirit of this year? We were promised that the collapse of communism would indeed bring up a new historical era, that triumph of liberalism and human rights, democratic practices, and free market economies. And if not perfect, at least these changes were understood as, in a way, the best that we could do. And in our volume, basically here in this edited volume, where is it now? Has everybody? Okay. The volume actually demonstrates that the promises of progress, as they were understood in the 1990s, were actually put aside, while there was still much work to be done. And in Eastern Europe, indeed, we see that time does not move, or history does not move in one direction. So that's kind of the basic idea of the book. Right. So in Eastern Europe, let me put it this way. Of course, we've already mentioned, these strongmen, these leader personalities like Orban. Of course, also the Kaczynski in Poland. We could again mention also Boyko Borisov in Bulgaria, but also Tsar Simeon 20 years ago. But the volume or the book here is actually not about populism, but actually about people. As I said before, we're trying to take a bottom-up perspective here and really look at the everyday perspective and everyday experience in post-socialism. So the book is actually about a range of individuals, rather, that have been affected by these changes and then generally try to make sense of them over the last 3 decades. Populism certainly being one possible answer to these challenges. So we're basically trying to, in a way, find out and see how people actually looked forward and backward to understand and navigate these changes, but also navigate the continuities. So the socialist past actually remains present and influential, and the post-socialist normality or reality for most people remains actually elusive. And this illustrates, again, that history does not travel in one direction, as we're putting it. So this multidirectionality of history is in a way the point of departure for our volume. It is actually premised on the belief that understanding the complexities of post-socialism requires the examination of these complexities from diverse perspectives. In other words, actually through the prism of what we then call real existing post-socialism. We're in a way, therefore, granting normal people the stage. We illustrate major systemic ruptures that were sometimes momentous, sometimes not really momentous for ordinary individuals. And we also point out in the same context that continuities from the pre-1989 period, and in some cases even from pre-socialism, shape people's understandings of the present, the past, and the future. Right. Yeah. So why this idea about now post-socialism? Yeah. Why do we use that term post-socialism? I'd like to get back to that point. Post-socialism. That's at least the decision we ultimately made. So Jill and myself appear to be in a way most suitable to analyze East Europeans' everyday lives at that time. Post-socialism actually refers to ideas, policies, and practices that have characterized the region and its people. Right, how does this relate to socialism? During socialism, in other words, during the Cold War, Eastern European states actually, in a way, at least following their ideologies, sought to transform politics, the economy, and society according to Marxist-Leninist principles. And as a result, East European populations often experienced and negotiated state policies in similar ways. So they had to deal with these realities of socialism, with real existing socialism. So they shared experiences of the socialist project, so to say. And in a similar way, they now share the experience of the post-socialist project. So the transformation of society according to Marxism-Leninism as an ideological foundation on the one hand, and then post-socialism, not really so much based on an ideology, but certainly also with very, very strong experiences of social life, such as deindustrialization, the decline of industries in the East European countries, privatization of industries, declining social entitlements, social benefits they had enjoyed during socialism. Then the ambiguities of democratization, the ambiguity also of EU integration and of globalization. So finally, post-socialist challenges and the linearity that is often associated with transition and underscoring socialist legacies, which are visible on multiple levels, including also styles of political leadership, corruption, and institutional dysfunction. All this is part of that experience of post-socialism and the post-socialist challenges. Now, as I mentioned before, we're also taking into account continuities, particularly elite continuities, but also other continuities of social relations that actually persist across that presumable rupture of 1989-1990. And so we're actually, in this volume, we're problematizing 1989 as the major rupture, and also suggest, of course, that's what our authors then do, we suggest alternative and multiple temporalities. Among these temporalities are, for example, those of former dissidents and political elites at the same time, who have presented 1989 as a definitive rupture, and also those temporalities, again, defining 1989 as a definitive rupture from the perspective of Viktor Orban or also Kaczynski in Poland, who has actually instrumentalize this idea of a rupture for their own strategic political purposes. So at the same time, of course, we acknowledge that the ruptures of 1989 were fundamental and therefore certainly also frightening for many people. But what was actually life-changing for some Eastern Europeans actually in most cases happened really months, years, or perhaps even a decade or more later than just in 1989, 1990. For instance, due to the variations with the socialist economies and governance, change, including engagements with other parts of the world, as we have them also in some of our chapters, foreign policies often began actually sometime before the fall of the wall. We see this, for example, in not only in our volume, but also in others, like by Teodora Dragostinova, the book The Cold War from the Margins, in which she basically analyzes Bulgarian cultural policies, cultural relations with countries of the global south during the Cold War. So basically points our attention at a different level of international relations that actually happened during the Cold War, but not necessarily only in the context of the Cold War. Some East European countries also experienced substantial economic change even before 1989. For example, we see the introduction of market mechanisms in the Polish and the Hungarian economies. Even this goes back in some cases to the 1960s with the new economic mechanism under János Kádár in Hungary. The advent and the rise of the Solidarność movement in Poland goes back to the late 1970s. And of course, also in the Soviet Union, glasnost and perestroika from the middle of the 1980s. So 1989, 1990 is not the exclusive year of change and rupture. But of course, also for many, the real changes, so to say, happen much later than 1989, 1990. Here, for example, we should mention EU accession by some East European countries in 2004 and then 2007. But we should, of course, also look at the global financial crisis of 2008, which probably contributed more to the present economic and social situation in these countries than the changes of 1989. So for some people also, the changes were not really the definitive rupture, but really one among many multiple ruptures. Taking this perspective, I think, is also in a way fruitful when it comes to indeed questioning this absolute character of the year 1989. Right. So certainly the collapse of communist dictatorships and the opening of the markets of these countries was initially at least welcomed by most people in Eastern Europe. However, only few of them really experienced these flourishing landscapes as the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl has promised them. And flourishing landscapes in reality, in most cases, really coexisted with barren fields, actually, and industrial ruins that can be observed in many regions. So barren fields, in a way, are both literal and figurative. And the crumbling industries that we see, that we have witnessed in Eastern Europe, are very characteristic for the region. So transition was certainly experienced unevenly, ambiguously, and in some cases even negligibly, depending also on the interpretations of changes and continuity that came up. So, yeah. We actually also in this volume, we're putting this term of real existing post-socialism as a parallel to the term of real existing socialism, as we know it from the period of the Cold War. real existing socialism, like real existing post-socialism, similar to real existing socialism, actually puts a light on this indeed often considerable gap between ideal and reality. So the whole term of real existing socialism, as it was actually popularized during the Cold War in Eastern Europe, indicated that there is indeed a gap, a difference between what the ideology, the pure ideology actually defined, and what the reality was. And in a similar way, we can probably also use the term of real existing post-socialism. So the gap here, pointing at the gap between the promises of liberal democracy and market capitalism on the one hand, and people's actual experience. This disconnect is largely related to the unexpected features of post-socialism, as we've mentioned them already, like social inequalities, institutional dysfunction, and corruption. Some characteristics of the socialist period, however, also, or even earlier periods, also saw similar characteristics such as inequalities, dysfunction, and corruption. So this was not exclusively the experience from post-socialism, but this is something that people had also gone through during socialism or even pre-socialism. In general, however, we want to make clear that that term, real existing post-socialism, kind of illustrates this this difference between this idealized vision of Western life that people had in a way been nourishing during socialism and the reality they were experiencing then. Right. Yeah. So now I'd like to go a bit more concretely, or talk a bit more concretely about the different chapters of our book. So we have divided it. We can probably also switch forward here to the table of contents.
Yeah, yeah.
Where is it?
Yes.
How can
You can do it.
with them? Oh, I see. I have to go to the presentation.
Yeah.
This one, yeah, I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. So as you see here as well, and as you've probably also seen when you looked at the book, it is divided into 5 parts, and each of them addressing a different aspect of this real existing post-socialism. So part 1 talks about socioeconomic transformations and examines blue and white collar workers' memories of post-socialism in Poland, the Czech Republic, and in Hungary. It's mainly based on oral history interviews, which we believed was suitable for that bottom-up perspective, and presents narratives of deindustrialization and privatization, and illuminates in a way people's ambiguous experience of economic change. The authors argue again that 1989 was not perceived as a turning point by all, particularly by Hungarians and Poles who had experienced market elements already prior to socialism. Again, the new economic mechanism could be mentioned here. Along with Czech workers, so the experience made by Czech workers, the rupture actually began then later, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, then with the influx of foreign companies. So we see market economy in Hungary and Poland already going, well, dating back in Hungary, for example, really to the 1960s. So 1989 did not really bring much of a change, at least not on that level. What really brought the change was then the rising presence of foreign companies, which came to Bulgaria, to Poland and Hungary as investors. This was a process, of course, that had a deep influence on the careers of people. And these chapters therefore demonstrate the complex ways that liberal market economies and, in inverted comma, Europeanization have shaped people's identities, work cultures, political choices, and also more generally their attitudes towards the transition. So there is chapter 1 by Joanna Wawrzyniak, which illuminates local memories of the transition, focuses on Polish engineers and skilled laborers whose enterprises were privatized and then sold to larger multinational companies years after 1989. Joanna Wawrzyniak interviewed engineers, and they made it very clear that 1989 was not the definitive rupture to them. Even the influence of foreign Western companies could in some cases be traced back to the 1970s, since state-run, state-owned enterprises in the centrally planned economy of Poland already had contractual relations with foreign firms, foreign companies, in order to facilitate their engagement and their connection with the global markets and global actors. And this goes back to the 1970s even. But of course, we also have discontinuities, which are more apparent in the case of laborers, especially then here female laborers, workers, as they were actually the first ones to be laid off then from their jobs during the shock therapy then of the early 1990s. So indeed, it is true, Poland really applied a very consequent neoliberal reform policy already in the early 1990s. So these individuals regarded the early transition certainly as a decisive break that dramatically altered the course of their lives, while on the political level, and particularly with regard to connections with foreign companies, we have continuities that go way back to the 1970s, in some cases even to the 1960s, and continue basically, and in a way are reactivated then in the late 1990s, early 2000s. In chapter 2 then, our author Andrzej Klipa, in a similar way, draws on the recollections of industrial employees, namely sugar plant workers in the Czech Republic. And he analyzes how economic change affected their daily lives, their political allegiances, and also their local cultures. In chapter 3, Anina Gagiowa, she analyzes the trajectories of small businesses, small business owners in Hungary, Hungary, which, similar to Poland, had introduced market mechanisms way before 1989. Market mechanisms that existed in a way parallel next to the centrally planned economy. So we have actually an officially initiated and also then in a way tolerated second economy in Hungary, which emerged particularly in the 1980s in order to satisfy consumer demand, and created also in a way a class of socialist entrepreneurs who then actually already anticipated a relatively seamless and successful transition to full capitalism then after 1989. Part 2, the politics of exclusion, the second part of the volume, explores the ambiguous experiences of sexual minorities and non-Western foreigners in Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria since the collapse of socialism. In all three states, the transition entailed instituting new rights and civil liberties, including the freedom of association and expression, also including the right to express one's gender identity and sexual orientation. Yet the transition also involved a definitive break with the socialist form of multiculturalism, dramatically expressed in the administrative expulsion of African students from Bulgaria after 1989 and the racial violence perpetrated against them by ordinary Bulgarians. Meanwhile, the reassertion of national identity in Hungary and Poland was expressed through the promotion of traditional values by right-wing groups, members of the Catholic Church, and also policymakers and also ordinary citizens. Consequently, Hungarians and Poles who had welcomed the open climate of the 1990s have since then experienced existential threats by their own states, despite the fact that these states are actually required by European law to protect them. So these chapters of the second part illuminate the unanticipated and contradictory outcomes of post-socialism for the LGBTQ community. So in chapter 4, Agnieszka Kosianska analyzes LGBTQ individuals' ambiguous experiences of both socialism and post-socialism in Poland. And she indeed analyzes this ambiguity, like between the legal possibilities that LGBTQ members, community members have to express themselves on the one hand, and the pressure and repressions they actually also suffer from the side of the Catholic Church and the political right. And therefore, and this is also what we see from interviews that the author conducted, some LGBTQ individuals feel that their invisibility under socialism, ironically, actually gave them a sense of freedom that they currently no longer enjoy. Even though, of course, also under socialism, they had been subjected to discrimination, violence, and state surveillance. So Kosianska then concludes that the story of LGBTQ rights and individuals' experience in Poland has been characterized not simply by progress and convergence with the West, but also by ambiguities and even reversals. In chapter 5, Hadley Rankin explores a similar context in the case of post-socialist Hungary, and indeed, in many cases, the tragic implications of these processes for sexual minorities and women in Hungary. Rankin largely tells here a story of rupture and regression, graphically evident particularly through or during the Budapest Pride March in 2007, when participants were violently attacked by ultranationalists. So such assaults have also been fueled by the policies of Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his party Fidesz. So Orban's hetero-nationalist project, this is the term that Rankin uses here, has undermined the original promise of post-socialism of increased social and political equality and inclusion, including also opportunities for diverse expressions of identity and particularly gender identity and sexual orientation. In chapter 6, the author Raya Apostolova analyzes the expulsion of African nationalists. We've mentioned that before, from Bulgaria in the 1990s, a practice that constituted actually a dramatic rupture from the socialist internationalism promoted by the regime and the reality of the 1990s. So here, the change was actually based both on ideological and financial factors. So after 1989, political leaders of different directions sought to distance themselves from the previous regime and even breaking, so to say, with the traditions of programs for foreign students that had existed in Bulgaria, who and these programs now being presented as a legacy, as relics of the socialist past and a financial drain on the Bulgarian economy. So the argument basically was that they had to be expelled for economic reasons mainly. Right, part 3, called Something Old, Something New, examines post-socialism through the lens of reproductive and sexual policies, practices, and beliefs in Romania. The authors illustrate that the transition to market economy and liberal democracy, including the introduction of new rights such as freedom of the press, association, and religion, have both actually been liberating and constraining. despite the fact that Romania has one of the highest rates of teen pregnancy and abortion and sexually transmitted infection rates in the EU, there is still no mandatory sex or sexual education curriculum in schools. Moreover, actually, some parents, along with conservative groups, are opposed to such a curriculum and reluctant to bring this to the schools and confront their children with such contents. So that young people actually have to rely mainly on friends, media, and NGOs to learn about sexual health and hygiene, which underscores the importance, of course, of a free press and free association. At the same time, women's reproductive freedom and health is being undermined by a lack of access to affordable contraceptives due to disinformation, and also medical professionals who refuse to perform abortions in public hospitals on presumably ethical grounds. And therefore, of course, we also have cases then of women and also teenage girls who take really then desperate measures to control their fertility, being basically by carrying out abortions or having them carried out by, in a way, dilettantes, actually. In chapter 7, the authors Beatriz Scutaro and Luciana Ginga look more closely and more concretely at the problem of sexual education in Romania's public school systems. They highlight young people's perspective and experiences and give voice to those who have been marginalized in the debates about this. So they operate, again, also very much based on interviews, on oral history sources. In chapter 8, Corina Dobosh examines how the combined influence of conservatism, neoliberalism, and misinformation has undermined women's reproductive rights in post-socialist Romania, with then the inevitable consequences, particularly for low-income women. So while reproductive rights actually expanded dramatically after 1989 with the decriminalization of abortion and introduction of family planning services, and also the subsidization of contraceptives for low-income groups, by the late 2000s, after Romania's access to the European Union, the situation changed due to the underfunding by the Romanian Ministry of Health and also doctors' refusals to perform abortions in public hospitals, as mentioned before. Right, yeah, so this is what Corina Dobosh kind of discusses in greater detail. Let's move on to part 4, origin stories, which examines the politics of refashioning one's adversary, the self, and the nation in Germany, respectively Eastern Germany, in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, and Hungary. Here, the authors argue that the uncertainty of the early transition provided actually a fertile ground for new beginnings, but also for reinventions, rationalizations, and resurrections, so to say. So some individuals, for the purpose of security and personal enrichment in the new liberal democratic order, sought to distance themselves from their own socialist past, while others, however, also embraced it. So the picture is very mixed here. Some also looked to the more distant past as an era of national glory and greatness. So this origin story, so to say, served the author's personal interests and as well as also the nation's, functioning as a type of sustenance during a time of crisis and uncertainty. So in a way, the recurrence to the nation as a framework for identity in times of uncertainty. So here we have in chapter 9 our author Till Hilmar, who discusses the type, so to say, the social type of the turncoat, the so-called turncoat, to illuminate how people apprehended and assessed work, Valley and community in East Germany and the Czech Republic after 1989. The turncoat is here regarded as an opportunistic individual who enjoyed special privileges due to their position in the communist system, and then basically try to take a leading position now in the development towards liberal market economy and liberal democracy. So now in the developments here, of course, were different in Czechoslovakia as compared to Germany, because in Germany we have this, the problem of elite continuity is a different one. In East Germany, leadership positions then were mostly actually taken by Western Germans after the reunification, while in Czechoslovakia, as in most other post-socialist countries, we see indeed a strong elite continuity. So here the turncoats, who now all of a sudden appear to be protagonists of liberal democracy and market economy. In chapter 10, we have Viktor Petrov, our author, whom I've mentioned already at the beginning, who explores how Bulgarian history has been reimagined since 1989, both by professional historians and amateurs. And he focuses on different episodes in this context, different episodes of Bulgarian history, so-called origin stories, in which narratives are basically developed which highlight Bulgaria's contributions to modern European statehood, Orthodox Christianity, Slavic culture, and world civilization. So Bulgaria is basically made into one of the, let's say, countries that provide the foundations for our world civilization. So a country of global importance. Right, yeah, so in other words, he actually explores how Bulgarians, in a way, inflate the importance and relevance of their own country, mainly, of course, in order to deal with their own national inferiority complex. In chapter 11, we have Sándor Horváth, who analyzes the interpretative strategies used by former members of the Hungarian Communist Party to narrate their past after 1989. While some of them claimed that party membership, so they, in an apologetic way, claimed that party membership was necessary for securing a job in their field and also for their professional development under socialism, others, especially those who joined the Communist Party in the late 1950s and the 1960s, claimed their commitment to social equality as a motivation and portrayed themselves as Marxist reformers and part of the new left, and in that respect even expressed pride when talking about their own membership in the Communist Party during the times of the Cold War. Finally, part 5, Home is Where the Heart Is, examines the significance East Germans and Romanians ascribe to their place of birth, which they conceptualize as both a geographical space and a state of mind. The authors argue that although the transition produced physical rupture from their country of origin in the form of the dissolution of it, like GDR, or the departure from it, like emigrating from Romania, both Germans and Romanians' connection to that country of origin remains strong. In the case of the East Germans, this connection is manifested in memories of the pre and immediate post-1989 period, while for Romanians, this connection is manifested in current relationships and political engagement. So Friederike Kind-Kovacs analyzes the memories of the youth of the time of the so-called Wende, the turn in Germany, in former East Germany, to illuminate how political and economic ruptures affected general aspects of young people's lives. Family, schooling, leisure also. She demonstrates that the youth acutely felt the changes of the period, especially because the very people they typically turn to for guidance, their parents, struggled themselves to cope with the uncertainty. For youths who remained in the East after unification, there were few continuities as caregivers and teachers lost their jobs and socialist youth organizations were disbanded. In chapter 13, Sergiu Gherghina and Raluca Farkas examine the Romanian diaspora's engagement in politics and popular mobilization back home. Compelled to leave Romania due to declining living standards, corruption, and government incompetence, the individuals featured in this chapter are committed to democratic principles and seek to effect change by voting. So we have this voting from the diaspora here as an important phenomenon and motivation. So their aim is actually to improve the political and economic situation from abroad, and ultimately they anticipate that they would then return to Romania one day. So first they would improve the situation in Romania by voting from abroad, and then once the situation has improved, they would actually return. Right, and this diaspora, of course, is very large, and therefore also highly relevant, of course, for the outcome of these elections. And at that time, at the same time, however, we also see now an increasing trend among the diaspora in supporting populist candidates, strongman candidates in the more recent elections, and this is certainly also a concerning trend. So far about this, summary of our book. Generally, the idea of the book is indeed to offer a reinterpretation, or at least offer perspectives of a reinterpretation of the transition of the year 1989-1990. We basically tried to take this bottom-up perspective, but from let's say 5 different perspectives. We certainly also laid a strong emphasis on the position and the, let's say, participation of minority groups in these processes as an aspect that we consider to be very sensitive and very indicative at the same time of the character of the transition and the developments of the last 30 years. So, as I said, the book is available for free on the website of Purdue University Press, and I hope that I, in a way, motivated you to, well, maybe not read the whole book necessarily, but at least take a closer look at it. Definitely the different chapters stand for themselves. Particularly for teaching purposes, one can also pick out the different chapters and use them maybe also in class. This is definitely what I'm going to do, and also what those who have already expressed interest in the book among my colleagues also decided to do. So far about that, of course, with my presentation, I'm of course now ready to answer questions. And to engage in a discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, comprehensive.
Yeah, hopefully.
We'll certainly include your book in our course bibliography. That's for sure. And we'll stop sharing now. There we are. And we normally start with questions from the floor.
Yeah.
So, yes.
It's a bit unfortunate in many ways that this wasn't put together after the invasion of Ukraine. That how far is the Germans, particularly what seems to be ambivalent, how far is that informed by their experiences of the Soviet era and the time since, when they think it's always been good? I don't know this area terribly well, but I've been to Poland and there was sort of in Poland particularly, there's a sort of nostalgia for the Soviet era because of the simplicity. That the sort of neoliberal, if you like, era was complicated. You know, instead of you choose to buy different things, instead of just being one simple thing. So my experience is limited, but it seems the East Germans particularly are very ambivalent about supporting Ukraine, which is odd because there's a sort of Cold War era person thinking, well, the only thing that kept the Russians.
Yeah, that's in a way, the contradictory part here, because one could probably assume that people like the East Germans or also the Poles who had, in a way, if you will, suffered from the Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe, now have a tendency of taking a pro-Russian perspective. Now, of course, we have to distinguish. This is certainly much, much stronger in East Germany than in Poland. So in Poland, we still have a very also historically much deeper rooted resentment against the Russians. So I'm not so much concerned about Poland in this respect, but much more about Eastern Germany. And this raises, of course, many questions of indeed, it is a little bit of a problem for our volume here that this the Russian invasion of Ukraine basically then came, so to say, in the middle of our of the production process of this volume, because certainly it changed the perspective to a certain degree, while at the same time actually so we didn't really have the opportunity and the possibility to really directly react to this. So just kind of quickly add a chapter about Ukraine or something like that. But I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a way actually underlines and confirms the views that you can also see in our volume. So this the problem with the disappointment and disillusionment regarding the developments of the last 30 years. So obviously, history of the last 30 years did not move in the direction towards democracy and liberal market economy. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine once again kind of confirms this. It is in a way the most radical expression of this disappointment, disillusionment, and actually now hostility towards the West that has obviously grown in at least parts of Eastern Europe over the last 30 years, while the West, for most of the time, still was happy to believe that, well, sooner or later, all these countries will arrive at where we are, so to say. And this is a hope that we basically that has been destroyed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, you were talking a lot about post-socialism and exploring its meaning and its implications. And I was struck by the fact that quite a lot of that was kind of quite top-down. It was political leadership, it was economic structure. I was wondering how you kind of navigated this idea of everyday life, normal people. I can see the selections you made, but did you find that quite difficult, that idea of capturing in a volume about several Eastern European countries' everyday life? And
yes, and yeah, I mean, some of the chapters contextualize everyday life more directly in the political environment. Others do it to a lesser degree, which already highlights the difficulty of navigating this. For example, when we look, at the chapters that deal with the continuity of market mechanisms, this is a highly, in Poland and in Hungary, this is highly political analysis, I would actually say, and not really that much of an everyday life experience. But what the book still, I think, illustrates is that particularly on the level of everyday life, change cannot be in a way imposed and commanded, so to say, so that actually a certain kind of grown social environment, of course, also produces certain social behavior and everyday experience. And this continues because you cannot just simply destroy everything, uproot everything, and build something new. So to look at, to take a concrete example, for as long as you, or as soon as you assume that these famous panel block quarters in different cities in Eastern Europe, these very emblematic panel block residence areas, that these, simply the physical reality of these panel blocks produces certain patterns of behavior, certain cultural patterns, then of course you come to the inevitable conclusion that these patterns of behavior and of social behavior, of culture, persisted across the system change because these panel blocks are still there until the present day. Yeah. So here we see continuities really on that level of everyday life. And the simple fact that you introduce a new constitution in a country, establish standards of a market economy, and have a multi-party system does not simply remove all these panel blocks and the living realities in these panel blocks. And this is something that I think is in a way pointed out in some of the chapters here, but not always to the same degree. Certain, of course, I mean, this is the volume is certainly in that respect, at least, quite heterogeneous, I would say. Yeah.
How distinctive each country is in this context. I'm struck that pretty much every chapter focuses on experience in one specific country.
Yeah.
So do we take from that they're all distinctive and we can't really make too many generalizations?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
Why are you arguing up on themes here?
Yeah.
These are, those go deeper than
I mean, communism or socialism as a system certainly did not make Eastern Europe into kind of a homogeneous bloc. And generally also this notion of the Eastern Bloc it does not really meet the historical reality very well. And we do see indeed significant differences between the different countries. These differences have to do also with the different starting conditions these countries were in at the beginning of the age of socialism. Some countries were already highly industrialized, like East Germany or Bohemia within Czechoslovakia, while other areas were still completely agrarian. Countries like Bulgaria and Romania, for instance, were almost entirely agrarian countries. And this certainly, of course, influenced the developments of socialism in these different countries. But at the same time, we also see significant differences in socialist or in policymaking by the different socialist regimes, which then also leads to a different experience of everyday life. Particularly, for example, when we look at reproductive policies, concerning abortion, for example, or other rights of women, for example, we see significant differences for example, between Romania and East Germany. So Romania had a relatively liberal approach towards abortion until 1966, when under Ceausescu, abortion was basically made illegal in order to raise the birth rates, actually. So here we see significant differences, and therefore it would certainly be wrong to assume that by looking at one socialist country, you automatically know everything about the others.
I wonder if I can ask a question about the concept of post-socialism that is in the title of the book. And is that the concept that most people use in Eastern Europe to refer to the period after 1989? And if that's the case, why not post-communism? Because if anything, what collapsed in 1989 was not socialism, but communism. And because, as you well said, in Bulgaria and Romania, there were socialist governments still in power. So what collapsed was collectivization. So why is it post-socialism and not post-communism?
Well, I mean, it's a legitimate question because, for example, again, we can look at Bulgaria. Right after the system change of 1989, 1990, the Bulgarian Communist Party renamed itself into Bulgarian Socialist Party.
Interesting.
So from the viewpoint of that party, socialism was obviously something that belonged to the time after 1989, while communism belongs to the previous period. So socialism is actually, so post-socialism, or they used the term socialism at the time of post-socialism. Right. I mean, this is, again, I mean, socialism is certainly a label that is very, very commonly and frequently used in, let's say, the everyday political discourses. So this was the SOTS period, as they would say in Bulgaria. They indeed, they say that, the communist period, they actually call it the socialist period. So it's, so the reason why we use it is indeed that this is most commonly used. But of course, you can always have endless discussions of whether it's really the accurate label. And when you look indeed at the way communist parties renamed themselves in particular, as socialism actually becomes part of their name after socialism. While at the same time, of course, during communist rule, they call their own system socialism. They, in their eyes, according to the Marxist and Marxist-Leninist ideology, communism was something that they were aiming at, but had not achieved yet. Instead, what they what the reality was real existing socialism. So, of course, I understand. You can have different views about this. But generally, I would also avoid actually simply the label communism for that period. But I could say the time of communist rule, for example, or communist regimes, because communists were ruling, but they had not established a reality, a social reality that could be called communist. But as I said, this is nothing I would be absolutely rigorous about. Yes.
Can I ask about Bulgaria? Because of course you live there, so you've been watching political trends in Bulgaria for some time now, haven't you? I was just wondering about the drop in political participation, the rise of the revival party, isn't it? And the kind of drift towards Russia.
Yes.
I mean, what exactly is the kind of message being conveyed by this pro-Russian party that's attractive to 17% of Bulgarians? I'm just wondering, what does that model have to offer? What does...
I mean, first of all, they're extreme nationalists. And nationalism is something that is still quite common among Bulgarians. So that's always something that you can kind of catch people with. And the other thing, however, is indeed also a widespread, in a way, anti-Western resentment in Bulgaria. And Bulgaria in particular also has this historical narrative that the Russians have liberated Bulgaria from the Ottomans in 1878. So they still have a certain tendency towards having a positive view on the Russians. For historical reasons. So to which degree this historical narrative is accurate or not is a different question. But this is the image, the Russians as the liberators. And this makes it easier in Bulgaria probably than in other countries of Eastern Europe to raise anti-Western and pro-Russian sentiments among the population. While this could probably not or this would probably be quite impossible in Poland and also in the Baltic countries in particular. So even if in Poland we also do have anti-Western resentments, this anti-Westernism is not at the same time a pro-Russian attitude. This is what makes Poland different from Bulgaria.
Oh, we have one online. Okay. So, can you unmute it? I'll try to unmute it. You can.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you for a really insightful talk first. My question relates to the memory and specifically the legacy of the Second World War in Eastern Europe. As we know, the war in the East killed millions and many villages and / cities were destroyed. So how was the war remembered in places like Romania, Bulgaria, who was actively participating in the German war effort? And how was this past reckoned with during and post-socialism? Thank you.
I don't know if you hear it, but the question is about the legacy and the memory of the Second World War in Eastern Europe and how that has, survived until today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So here certainly we have to distinguish between Romania and Bulgaria. In the Bulgarian case in particular, there wasn't actually that much fighting and that much destruction. The Soviet army, the Red Army, actually invaded Bulgaria on the 8th of September 1944 without actually meeting any military resistance. This was already towards the end of the war. And Bulgaria had already made it clear that they were trying to get out of the war, out of the alliance with Germany. So that when the Red Army then invaded Bulgaria, actually no real fighting actually took place. It is true that the Bulgarian government at that time, which was still not a communist government, was actually simply trying to get out of the war and was hoping that the Soviet Union would not invade Bulgaria, not occupy Bulgaria. But then once they did it, on the 8th of September 44, no organized resistance was actually put up against this. In Romania, also the combat was not really so highly intense. This has also something to do with the fact that the German forces were, of course, already actively retreating from these two countries. So, in other words, the Soviet presence, both in Romania and Bulgaria, was not that much associated with war, combat, and destruction. And therefore, the beginning, let's say, of the Soviet presence in these countries does not have this strong, let's say, negative connotation as we have it in other countries.
Can I ask about this demographic and incredible collapse in demographics that you're experiencing now, and also the collapse in political participation? This is in comparison with what period? I mean, are we comparing with the demographic situation before 1989? And I wonder if that is comparable when perhaps mobility was not feasible. And in the sense of political participation, when political participation perhaps was mandatory rather than voluntary.
No, but we're comparing it in our volume. It is being compared with the early 1990s.
Okay.
So when indeed the system change was still very recent, and we have indeed obviously a high motivation, high social motivation to participate in political life. So as I've pointed out, when the new post-communist constitution was drafted for Bulgaria by the Constituent Assembly in 1991 here, the voter turnout for that assembly was 91%. Turnout still remained very high throughout the 1990s. But then since the 2000s, basically since 2005, I would say it has really dropped significantly and is now really on that level of roughly 1/3 actually of the electorate actually participating in the elections. And similar numbers can also be found in other Eastern European countries. So we see really a significant development here, a very significant decline in combination also with ongoing emigration. So that countries like Bulgaria, but also others, are really losing a significant portion of their population. And so again, Bulgaria has gone down from 9 million at the beginning of the 1990s to less than 7 million now. So this is, almost 1/3 of the population, which they lost. And again, this is probably the most significant reaction to the ambiguities of the transition and also the ambiguities of the development of the last 30 years of post-socialism. That these countries indeed are simply shrinking. Apart from the question which political orientation they actually take.
And of course, that these factions that are nationalistic will be against resolving the situation with immigration, I guess.
Right. Well, yeah, they are against immigration, and so they will not really contribute to a demographic recovery of the countries.
Any more questions? I think we have taken really all the patience and all the energies of Markus, frankly. So I think we should give him a big applause and say thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was a great pleasure.
Really a pleasure. Thank you very much, people at home. And we'll stop here now the recording. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.